The receipt lay on the floor like a small, insolent punctuation. The 0 was jagged, the ink pressed through the cheap paper in a way that made it look deliberate, an angry hole rather than a circle. Sarah saw it first in the scrape of fluorescence and the dull clatter of plates, the sound that filled the restaurant in the thin hour after the late shift. She had the receipt folded into her palm for a long time before she smoothed it out on the counter and let the memory of it settle like lemon oil on her fingers. She folded the paper again, careful, as if folds could rearrange certainty. A note had been tucked beneath the printed totals, 4 words in a cramped, impatient hand. Prove it. Pier 59. Midnight. The jagged 0 hovered over the bill like a challenge. It had been dropped, she realized, the receipt skittering from the crease of a suit jacket as a man had turned away. Someone had let it go on purpose. Someone wanted to be found out, or wanted to make sure someone noticed. At home, Leo's dinosaur nightlight blinked on and off in the dark. He breathed with the small rhythm of sleep and medication. 2 slow inhales, a pause, an exhale that rattled at the edges. Sarah listened to the sound like a ledger. Each breath was a line item. The hospital had sent bills in envelopes that never fit anywhere in the drawer. They nested between coupons and sticky notes, like small inevitable storms. The name on the bills was her son's, but the math meant her gaze. Sometimes, cleaning tables, she caught herself counting the seconds the way she counted money, the tilt of a glass, the time it took a patron to sign. She had learned to read people in the span of a lunch rush. An arched eyebrow when the dessert arrived told her whether the table would tip. The neatness of a signature told her whether a man lied about his name. Service creates a kind of peripheral vision. Other people's edges become your landscape. You notice the lemon rind left in a martini glass, the faint ring of lipstick on a napkin, the slight tremor in a man's hand when he signs his name and tries to make it steady. Those were the habits that had kept them alive. Leo's medicine paid for in shifts, the small economies of scraps and leftover shifts. Pier 59 smelled of salt and diesel when she arrived. Fog rolled low across the pilings and the lights from the yachts turned into pale moons on the water. The note had felt like a dare. She had gone because she had to know what it meant, because curiosity in the absence of other options had the same weight when your child needed another operation. He was waiting near the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, a man whose careful coat seemed to absorb the dim. Ethan Sterling watched the 0 like someone who read punctuation for meaning. People called him many things: patron, benefactor, whispered rumors that picked at the corners of the boardroom and the underpass.
Tonight, he looked more like an experimenter than a rumor, someone interested in what would happen if he put a very bright light on someone ordinary. "You saw the 0, he said without preamble, voice folded into the hush of the water. Sarah held the receipt like an accusation. "You left it." He smiled, a careful smile, the kind a man with lawyers practiced in the mirror. "Not left, placed. I wanted to see if the person who picked it up would notice anything else." There should have been a line then, she thought, a place to refuse. But there are no clean lines between need and concession when the ledger of a small life runs small, when a child's cough is a whisper that builds into something louder at night. Ethan's offer was simple when he said it: help for her boy's surgery in exchange for a kind of honesty. He wanted someone to notice what the numbers hid, a fresh set of eyes, the kind that worked in the peripheral, someone who could sit at the edge of a warehouse floor and see not just pallets, but the patterns in how they were logged. "We've had losses," he said, "and not the kind that happened by accident." He did not call it a favor, he called it an arrangement. It suited him. It suited the world in which he moved. There was no official job posting, no HR packet slid across a laminate desk. There was a presence, a test. Come alone, be at certain docks at certain times, watch. He promised nothing more than access and a contact card the size of a matchbook. He did not promise immunity from consequence. "If you want to help your son," he said, "you have to be useful." Sarah thought of the bills stacked like thin buildings in the kitchen drawer, of Leo's drawings that layered over one another in his school folder, dinosaurs with bandages sometimes, as if his small mind had already mapped out stitches and recoveries. She thought of the jagged 0. She thought too of the way people placed their world between a tip and a signature. There was something bright and dangerous about being asked to look, like the way a spotlight can expose both the dirt and the hidden pattern. She accepted because she always accepted things she believed she could manage. She accepted because morals were a kind of algebra, and this trade had a simple balance: notice in return for medicine. He told her what to do in a voice that was all practicality. Start with manifests, learn the marks, look for discrepancies, roundings, repeated initials, courier stamps. The first few nights he was doing the teaching himself, standing behind crates in warehouses that smelled of salt and varnish. He had a patient way of unpacking systems for someone who had not worked inside them. He taught her how to read stamps as if they were fingerprints, the way an ink blot seeped, the wear on a corner that told you how many hands had brushed it. He made time for small, private rehearsals, how to hold a clipboard, how to keep a list. The job was not glamorous.
It was the opposite, cadence and tedium. 100 small notes that added up only when someone bothered to line them up against one another. She spent hours tracing numbers on manifests with a borrowed pen, her thumbnail staining blue from the cheap ink. She learned that a 10% slip showed itself when tallies should have stayed thin and exact, when a crate listed 5 boxes and the inventory recorded 4, when a mark MT recurred like a signature, a small stamp that was never explained. The mark was slight at first, no bigger than a coffee stain. On the third day, under a stack of cold font manifests, she found another MT, pressed in the corner, as if someone had nicked it against a desk while signing a lesser document. It repeated enough times to become a rhythm, and once you hear a rhythm, you cannot unhear it. Sarah began to notice the pattern outside the paper, a shift that ended early on certain nights, a courier who always missed the morning boat, a pallet that was never asked about when it left the dock. Inside the restaurant, Jessica, her coworker, noticed that Sarah's eyes were different. People who work with the public and then go to work with the whisper world of logistics take on a different posture, less the quick smile of hospitality and more the folded attention of someone cataloging everything. Jessica's envy came not from cruelty, but from the small, blunt arithmetic of the backroom. Sarah was getting something Jessica had been denied. They were friends by necessity and distance. Their solidarity was practical, less sentimental. Jessica brought Sarah coffee sometimes, and once when Sarah left her apron by the sink, Jessica tucked into the pocket a folded dollar, the way sailors used to tuck away charms for luck. The more she leaned into the work, the more parts of her life came to feel like evidence. At the clinic, a scheduler with a quick laugh and tired eyes penciled in the handful of dates that kept them afloat. The doctor's office smelled like rubbing alcohol and lemon-scented wipes. Leo's arm was always a little sticky afterwards. Sarah spent nights with the sheets pulled up to her chest, the receipt folded under her pillow like a talisman. She logged each new charge on a notebook because Ethan had told her to keep analog records, paper that could not be altered by a single keystroke. Paper is clumsy, it is imperfect, and for that reason paper can sometimes be truer than a database. Her work looked small from the outside. She stood at the edge of warehouses and watched the scanners and the blinking lights of conveyor belts, noting the time the scanners churred when a pallet passed, the stamp that a courier pressed on the manifest when the load left. She began to draw matches between entries. A crate listed by a manifest as going to an internal facility that had no record of receiving it. A pallet that should have gone to a retail partner, but vanished into an unmarked truck with a license plate that blurred in the security footage. There was a language to this, a grammar that mapped the bureaucracy of theft as if it were a dialect. She learned it by overhearing foremen curse at a radio and watching the shadow of a clipboard cross someone's hand. Ethan continued to be a figure who moved at the edges of her evenings, a man who could be present and distant at once. There were moments when he offered her coffee in a thermos and listened as she read lists to him like a child reading homework. He would correct a number here, point out a correlation there, his tone neither condescending nor kind, but precise. Once, standing under the warehouse lights, he told her, "People don't hide things in plain sight because they're clever. They hide them there because they assume the crowd won't look close enough." She kept finding the same little details she had always found. Lemon rind in a sink, a stain on a manifest that looked like coffee but turned out to be olive oil, a courier stamp smudged where someone had pressed harder to hide the initialing. Each of these was a tiny hinge. 100 tiny hinges could swing a door. At first, the work felt like private geometry. She would write the numbers in the margin of the manifests and carry them home, stacking paper on the kitchen table where Leo's cast-offs and school markers crowded the edges. Her life became a ledger of small reconciliations, a piece of evidence in exchange for a scanned email that promised authorization for a pre-op date, a confirmed mismatch in exchange for a check that paid for a specialist consult. The trade was raw and sometimes humiliating. She accepted handshakes in dim offices and cooked dinners in the chef's kitchen in exchange for time with the manifests. She learned to let her face be ordinary so that observation would be less threatening. Veronica Vance watched in a different register. She moved in places where chandeliers and the scratch of polished shoes mattered more than the smell of lemon juice. Veronica ran the gala committees and shook hands with board members in a way that suggested permanence. When Sarah first encountered her at a fundraiser, an event meant to smooth the edges between wealthy donors and philanthropic theater, Veronica appeared composed, lit from within by confidence. Her smile was designed to suggest inevitable assent.
Sarah watched her watch the room like someone reading a script backwards and felt a small, reluctant admiration for the meticulousness. There were subtleties to Veronica's methods, an offhand remark about schedules that would later be cited as a reason to shift responsibilities, a compliment so precise it felt like a map. Her favor could be weaponized as easily as it could be given.
In the logistics of power, charm performs as a lubricant. Veronica had it in a practiced glint. Marcus Thorne moved in a different way. He had the posture of someone accustomed to short-circuiting rules. He treated the manifests like something to be negotiated with a shrug and a half-smile. Marcus's presence at the docks was like a low tide. He made an absence feel routine. He had a way of stepping into conversations and altering their gravity, like a hand on a scale, small and deft. He liked to make deals that were framed as convenience, and then watch them become patterns. Sarah's discoveries sometimes brushed up against them both. She would notice Marcus leave early on nights when certain manifests showed odd rounding. She would see Veronica speak softly with the director of logistics, as if they were rearranging a chessboard. Such interactions were small, perhaps, when viewed individually, but Sarah had learned to line up items and watch a shape form. The first time she called it to Ethan, "There's a 10% drop here and MT appears on these manifests." He did not look surprised. He only nodded, as if he had been waiting for the moment she'd call it map. "You're seeing what matters," he said. "Keep the lists, keep the paper. People who rely on algorithms assume someone else will fix the human noise." He emphasized paper with the tone of someone aware that the world was changing into something easier to erase. Sarah began to keep a separate folder at home, notched and labeled. Each receipt slid between tissue paper like fossils. The receipts accumulated the way night shifts accumulate fatigue, a small mass of things that belonged to the same life. They smelled faintly of lemon, of grease, of coffee. There were small social costs to visibility. Jessica whispered once about the way other servers glanced when Sarah walked into the dining room after a shift at the docks. Henderson, the restaurant manager with a face that never quite suggested rest, offered late-night advice couched in warnings. "Don't make plans you can't keep," he told her in the back office, his voice low and practical. It came out like good sense and small cruelty. If you want to stay in the restaurant life, you have to keep your life small enough to fit beneath a lamp. But the life Sarah had to keep was already too big to fit. Leo's cough had a way of stretching time into long nights. Once, in a clinic waiting room stacked with others whose pain was folded into patterned carpets and children's drawings, a nurse looked at Sarah's hands, the way the nails were raw from opening packages at second jobs, and asked if she had a support system. "No," she said, because the truth would not make the forms any shorter. Just things to do. There were other small victories, too. A courier named Mateo left his thermos on a crate, and when asked if he remembered seeing the truck number on a particular night, he gave her a shrug and a story about rain and the scanner failing.
He had calloused fingers like someone who used his hands, and a soft voice that held its own reticence. He would later become the kind of witness who kept memories like receipts, small things that stacked into truth. For now, he was a man who made lunch runs and forgot which day the tide was higher. The rhythm of her days became a sequence of folded tasks. She watched manifests under fluorescent light, and then came home to make sandwiches for Leo. She slept a little less and made lists a little more. Ethan was sometimes present and sometimes not. He would slide an envelope across a polished surface when he thought a chest needed filling. It was never full, but it kept them afloat. He refrained from speaking about his reach in explicit terms. He allowed ambiguity to do his work. To some, he was a man who opened doors. To others, a man who opened them only for reasons that would later be explained. The work of noticing conjured a strange intimacy with the world's small betrayals. Sarah kept track of the way a courier would stamp a manifest with MT and then slide it across to someone who would sign it as routine. She would show Ethan the margins where handwriting varied, the same courier, different nights, different pens, same initials. They would sit in a dim office with a single lamp and trace the smudges with a finger. Paper resisted being a perfect record. It bore the human error and the coffee rings and the shorthand that people trusted. Sometimes the stakes weighted the air so heavily she could hardly move. The night she sat in the car outside the hospital and watched the neon rotate over a roofline, Leo's Band-Aid scarred drawing of a dinosaur held to her like a promise. She had learned, through a lifetime of booking Band-Aids and cold compresses, that promises alone did not mend bills. They made a shape, yes, but they also needed ledger entries to become action.
That thought kept her fingers moving across forms and manifests. At a small after-hours training, Ethan handed her an old magnifier, like something from a detective novel. "You'll find that people leave themselves traces," he said. He did not specify whose. He believed in the cumulative truth of small things. He believed in structure. She believed in the immediacy of her son's breathing. Between them there was a bargain struck without sentiment. Not everyone responded kindly to the bargain. Veronica's smile at the gala tightened into a thin line when Sarah was singled out at a staff meeting for a presentation about audit awareness. Sarah had been asked to stand up under a bright lamp and speak about anomalies, 10%, MT marks, the smell of lemon rind on envelopes, and the room had the texture of scrutiny. Board members looked as if they were comfortable with the violence of numbers that never touched their own accounts.
Veronica lent the room her smile, and then later, when she passed Sarah in a corridor, made a point of touching her elbow in the way of someone acknowledging a subordinate whose rise must be measured. It was in the way small things can aggregate into pressure that real danger arrived. Marcus began to look at Sarah with a new civility, one that felt like an assessment. He seemed interested in her movements, what docks she favored, which nights she left early. He would joke in the break room, his laugh too big for the space, and watch the way she responded. Sarah noticed and logged it in her head like everything else, a potential pattern, another data point. There were nights when the ledger challenged her sense of rightness. She would sit at the kitchen table, receipts spread like a rough map, and think of the kid with a dinosaur nightlight snoozing in the other room. She would trace a line from a tiny marking on paper to a payment she could not quite promise he would get. Sometimes she felt like a seamstress stitching a fabric that refused to stay whole. Other nights she felt something like hope, small as a stamp, solid as a corner fold. The job was making her useful in a way she had not allowed herself to be for years. A month in, one small victory looked like permission. She found a manifest that matched a sequence of vanishing items. The paper showed the tell, a crate listed for a supplier in Queens that never received it. The courier log showed a route strangely abbreviated. The scanner chime audio file contained a duplication, as if someone had looped a part of the recording to make the timestamps match. She took pictures with her phone, blurry at the edges, but clear in center, and slid them into the folder she kept in a shoebox under the bed. The shoebox was both evidence and an inventory of her nights, receipts, bus transfers, the jagged zero, Leo's drawings. Ethan reviewed her folder in the glow of a desk lamp and nodded. "Paper has texture," he said. "It frays. People forget which corner they folded. Those edges can become signatures if you know how to match them." "You're sure about this?" she asked, because the question kept returning like an account she could not close. "Not sure," he said, "but we have enough to ask for more access." The ask translated into permission to be closer to the logistics office, to handle manifests before they passed through the system, to be given the cleaning shift that allowed late entries. It was a small escalation, and yet it changed her world. Suddenly she could follow a line of shipments from the point of origin to the margin. It felt like stepping inside the skin of a machine and being able to listen to its gears. There were social penalties. People called her a brown-noser at the staff meeting. Henderson muttered a comment about being careful of who you trust to not underestimate you. "Positions change you," he told her once, "the way men with tenure imagine themselves wise." But the change she felt was quieter, a steady accrual of understanding, the sensation of a knot untying slowly. Veronica's texture of attention shifted too. She started to ask more questions in the meeting about process stabilization and about who has the keys to certain access points. Her charm comprised now an undercurrent, a suggestion that certain visibility had a cost. Her eyes held a kind of arithmetic. Keep someone close, keep them accountable. Make an act of gratuitous kindness, and then keep it in ledger form, so favor could become leverage if necessary. Sarah learned to keep her face even when curiosity and fear ran through her like small electric currents. She kept the receipt with the jagged zero in a pocketbook beneath a pile of grocery coupons. It was a small object that had initiated the sequence. She had carried it like a prayer and a proof. The note, "Prove it," had become frayed. A dare, yes, but also a way she could measure herself in nights. If she could stitch enough small truths together, she could buy the medical intervention Leo needed, and perhaps in time buy them a different life. In the background lay a truth that refused easy settlement. This was not a single villain scheme. It was a network that sanded its edges by practice. The 10% took shape not in one person's pockets, but in habits. It required complicity and convenient forgetfulness, and the mechanical confidence of people who believed that paperwork could be stretched without tearing. One night, as winter tightened and her breath steamed in the exterior air, she stood on a loading dock with a pair of slabbed manifests in her hand,
and watched a truck back up to a berth. The driver's jacket read like a map of other hours, faded, patched at the elbow, hands that had been in motion for years. He stamped the paper with a practiced flick. The stamp read MT, slightly smudged where the ink had been squeezed. He moved away and left the paperwork as if it were no more significant than a prayer left on a pew. Sarah took a photograph from a distance, hands steady because she had trained them to be. She slid the manifest into her folder, closed the car door, and drove home in the thin post-midnight yellow, thinking that the sum of small currents had to be made into something sturdy. She did not see the first hand that would turn against her. Power has a way of recognizing its own shadows and then deciding whether to extinguish them. Veronica, for all her smile, had long stopped tolerating things that might complicate her ascent. She watched reputations like a gardener watches plants that might overgrow a hedge. Marcus, for all his cough of jokes and casualness, had begun to look like someone who could be maneuvered when the occasion demanded. They both understood publicity and the neat arithmetic of consequence. The first rumblings came in the form of an invitation to a meeting that read like routine, a conversation about careful oversight.
Sarah signed a sheet and went in believing it would be another talk about processes. She came out with someone else's ledger in the shadow of her footsteps and a feeling like cold rain on the back of her neck. A small rumor began to grow wings, that whatever anomalies she had flagged had also coincided with a period when certain shipments were unaccounted for. The ledger had its own public life. When she tucked Leo in that night, she put the jagged 0 receipt on his bedside table beside his dinosaur drawing. The little circle on the paper glinted like a bruise. She did not tell him what the receipt meant. Children do not need to carry the collateral of adult decisions. But she pressed her forehead to the top of his head and breathed in the smell of his hair, lemon and sweat, and the faint antiseptic of the clinic. This was not a heroic decision. It was a ledger entry in the algebra of care. It was the way she loved, with attention. Outside, under the low hum of the city, a different set of hands was beginning to arrange paper into a kind of narrative. A file would find a desk. A voice would suggest a coincidence that could be made to look like intent. A transfer would be framed in the language of access and error. Paper could be coaxed into accusation if you pressed hard enough. Veronica sat in a room with a mahogany table and a glass of water that left a ring, and she traced the edges of staff assignments with an index finger. Her spreadsheet showed a clear, clean revision. She liked to be surgical. Her voice, when she spoke to a small circle of allies, was the precise instrument of a seasoned conductor. Notes in the right order, not a single wasted tone. "We have to consider perception," she told them, and in that phrase there was a soft, lethal kind of truth. Men like Marcus, she suggested, could be corralled into appearing as the weak link if needed. She did not speak of ruining a life. She spoke instead of stabilizing the system's optics. Somewhere between a whisper and a plan, a transfer vanished from the records and then reappeared in a version that bore Sarah's access code. The jagged 0 in her pocket felt suddenly heavier, like an accusation she had not yet read. Sarah slept badly that week, waking to the small shush of Leo's breathing and to the small, inexorable arithmetic of forms. When the call came asking her to come to a meeting about clarifying procedures, she thought it would be a formality. She clipped her notes together, took the jagged 0 from the pocket of her coat and flattened it, as if the crease might hide nothing. In her bag, the stack of manifests pressed against the cardboard of a takeout box like promises making shape. She walked into a room where light felt clinical and where a small group had gathered, whose smiles had the particular stiffness that comes with rehearsal. Veronica's hand rested on the table as if testing the walnut. Marcus's presence was a dark arc in the room. There were other faces, lawyers who spoke in rounded statements, a man from accounting with an expression like a stamp. Someone slid a folder across the table toward her. The sound of paper moving in the room felt like finality. Sarah opened it with the kind of hands that have learned to perform small miracles with receipts and stamps. And there, inside, under a sheen of official notation, was a manifest that had her initials tied to a transfer that had the hallmarks of the small discrepancy pattern she had been tracking. The MT mark, the 10% rounding, a chain of small things made into a single accusation. Around the table, the air pulled taut. Veronica's voice came with the softness of a practiced blade. "We need to be accountable. We need to know who touches the paper and how." Sarah looked at the faces that flanked hers. Ethan's seat across from the table sat empty, a deliberate absence.
For a moment she felt the world reduced to the triangular space between the folder, her hands, and the jagged zero in her pocket. The zero looked different now, less challenge, more indictment. She could feel the ledger balancing in a way she had never intended. The receipt she had folded and kept, the little notations she had thought were a path to safety, had become the very instruments someone else could use. Outside, the city busied itself with its usual insignificances. Inside the room, the math had shifted. She had come to Pier 59 with a note and a hope. She had learned what stamps meant, and had stacked evidence like a fortress. She had thought that paper would shelter truth. In the soft light of the meeting room, the paper threatened to smother it. There are moments that feel like the hinge of a book. For Sarah, the hinge felt like cold air on the back of her neck and a folder sliding through her hand. She could see the jagged zero in the palm of her hand pressed like a key into the skin. She had not yet known whether she would be accused, expelled, or enlisted in something larger. She only knew what she had always known, that to keep a life you must sometimes bear the shape of other people's choices. She gathered the folder and the small tremulous list of manifests and walked out of the room into an undefined corridor. The sense that the air had shifted behind her stayed like a smell of lemon rind. She had not yet fallen, the arc had not completed, but someone had turned a page that might make her next lines different. Outside, on the sidewalk under the weak street lamp, she flattened the receipt with the jagged zero against her palm and thought of the way paper keeps memory. She thought of Leo's drawings, of the way he had once given her a picture of a mother as a person who could see things. The note he would make years from now, to Mom who sees things, did not yet exist. For now there was the scratch of a pen, a folded note, and the thin, angry circle that had started all of it.
Behind her, in a room trimmed in polished wood and precise smiles, Veronica prepared the next movement with the confidence of someone who believed the ledger would bend where necessary. The work of framing is not sudden. It arrives in small permissions granted and taken away, in the recasting of a narrative until the facts suit a story. A transfer could be re-recorded, a stamp could be reinterpreted, a signature could be made to read like a confession when the chorus around it swelled just enough. Sarah walked home under an indifferent sky. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon and diesel, the two scents that had become the motif of her days. She kept her jaw set and the receipt folded neatly in her pocket, as if holding the paper close might stave off whatever had been set in motion. On the kitchen counter, Leo's nightlight blinked like a small, stubborn star. She put the folder down, washed her hands, and sat at the table with the small mountain of papers the way people once sat before a ledger. She lined up the receipts, the stamps, the little MT marks, and began to make sure that everything she had collected could stand up to the new weight. Somewhere, unseen, a plan that smelled of control and optics continued to move. For now, she had her receipts, her magnifier, and a list of small truths. For now, that was enough to begin. She folded the folder against her chest as if it might be a shield, and walked until the city swallowed the taste of that sterile meeting room. The jagged zero tucked into her pocket felt heavier than anything she had carried before. It was not just paper. It was a punctuation that had begun to rearrange the way other people read the world. Outside, the night smelled of diesel and lemon from a street vendor's putt, and for a long moment Sarah let the ordinary street sounds settle her like a metronome. She had been accused with paper. She would answer with paper too. The first official move came the next morning in an email that was plain and terrible. Human Resources requested a temporary reassignment pending review. A public memo floated to the staff bulletin board, clinical and measured, concerns regarding access. The words were bland and precise the way teeth can be. They cut. Henderson, in the kitchen, said little, but his silence was a kind of verdict. Jessica, who had once slipped a crumpled tuller into Sarah's apron, touched her arm and then drew back as if some current had passed. When the cashier at the clinic asked Sarah if everything was okay, and her smile folded into shyness because the forms trusted no confidences, Sarah lied. Just paperwork, she said, and carried Leo's backpack like a ledger for two. In the motel that night, she spread the manifests across the bedspread and thought of how paper could be sharpened into accusation. She slept in the clothes she had worn at the meeting, rolled in the smell of the diner grease and the faint antiseptic of the hospital, because it felt easier to keep on the armor than to take it off. Ethan's absence from the meeting had been deliberate. It was a choice that would press against him later like a bruise that would not stop aching. He did not call the next morning. When he finally reached her, his voice was polite and guarded, in a way that made blunt admission impossible. "We need to follow process," he said. "Let the auditors do their work." His language was careful. It sounded like a man who knew the exact perimeter of risk and measured his breath to it. Sarah heard the weight of the phrase, process, and felt the slow turning of things that would not be quick. She needed money for the operation now, not audits. Ethan offered the kind of distance that looked like virtue from his side of the corridor. From Sarah's side, it looked like abandonment. The frame Veronica had prepared was not elegant. It was the work of people who believed bureaucracy could be a weapon because it was indifferent. Somewhere, a transfer that had no business bearing Sarah's initials had been recorded, a stamp placed in a ledger, as neat and as false as a signature forged in a photocopier. Marcus's name did not appear on the paper in black letters that said culpable. Instead, the machine of the system had been fed a small deliberate error and then allowed to amplify it. It took a shape that was bureaucratic and therefore, for many, unassailable. Sarah did not have legal counsel. She had receipts and habits and a stubbornness that had been honed in the heat of dinner services. She called JR first because he was the person who had taught her how to read a Pier's rhythm. He answered on the third ring with a voice that suggested sleep and cigarettes and the small kindness of people who work nights. "You all right, Sarah?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I have things." "What do you need me to do?" "Come down, bring a camera, bring hands that will get dirty." JR arrived at dusk with a jacket smelling of engine oil and a grin that held more steadiness than spectacle. He moved through the docks like a man with the right to the air. He knew where the boat rental slips were kept, which foreman liked to leave drawers unlocked, which security guard nodded off by the heater. He had been a dock worker long enough to understand how the world folded into small conveniences that could become evidence if someone was willing to notice. Mateo came next, slow and careful with his thermos and the habit of remembering ordinary details. He brought a story. The night a truck had backed up to berth 11, and the scanner had chirped twice, but the audio file later contained only one chirp. "The scanner goes off," he said, sipping from his thermos. "You can tell when people are paying attention."
That night, someone hit a button on the machine because it gave them the time they wanted. His voice dropped around the edges as if the truth was an unlit cigarette he did not want to inhale. They began in the ways Sarah had learned to begin any evening of salvage: paper, patience, repetition. She spread the folder on a rickety folding table in a rented room above a laundromat, the kind of place where machines hummed like distant servers and the air tasted faintly of laundry soap. The manifests looked different in the motel light, the ink dark and moral. JR leaned in and steadied a corner with a thumb calloused from holding ropes. Mateo opened his thermos and offered coffee with a hand that shook slightly when he was nervous. Together they traced the chain of entries, matching stamps to times, footprints of courier routes to GPS aggregators that still held the ghost of every trip. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected noise, the chirring of an old scanner saved in an archived file. Mateo had seen the file referenced in a routine ledger note and had the patience to request access. The archived audio had been looped, precisely edited to make timestamps match. It was crude but effective. At 2:13, the scanner chirped twice in the audible file. Earlier edits had spliced another chirp to cover a missing window. The audio made a pattern, the fraying around the edges of a story that had been stitched. JR found the boat rental slip at a small shop near the pier where fishermen bought hooks and cigarettes. The owner, a man who smelled perpetually of salt and diesel, had kept a stack in a drawer in case someone needs tent. The slip bore a faint smudge where someone had tried to rub out a number, and the handwriting was different from the printed columns. "You see how someone pressed harder there?" JR said. "That's not rushing the math. That's someone changing a line." They assembled the receipts like a choir of small testimonies. Each one was imperfect and stubborn. The jagged zero kept surfacing, on the mouths of every napkin where people had scribbled, on a grocery receipt from a convenience store near the docks, on a parking stub from an SUV that had been seen coming late. The zero was now a motif of attention, a taunt, a kind of shorthand for the idea that someone had been asking to be noticed. Sarah drafted letters and wrapped them in envelopes, the way she had watched people sign checks. The way she folded paper had always been a ritual of intent. She visited the clinic with the manifests tucked into a waterproof folder and told the scheduler she needed time off for court dates behind a polite lie. The scheduler offered a string of practical gestures, lists of pro bono lawyers, names of clinics that did sliding scale, and Sarah cataloged them like blessings with caveats. She was careful not to invite pity. She knew pity could be rearranged into a narrative that made her powerless. Word of the frame traveled the way such things do, in small circles that quieted down when larger circles approached. Veronica's allies tightened in a way that suggested preparedness. She called for audits and legal reviews, like someone who was both confident of the weather and in command of the map. In boardrooms, she spoke of perception and organizational hygiene, and of the need to protect donors from scandal. On the face of a memo she wrote, her signature looked almost like a stamp itself, neat, rehearsed, irrevocable. Ethan watched from the periphery as the gears ground. He moved with a cautiousness that yearned to be decisive. His version of decisiveness, however, had earlier been to place a man in the dark and ask him to watch what light revealed. Watching the smear of consequences unfold with Sarah at the center unsettled him. He did not like being the author of a contract that had been used against his witness. When he finally came to the motel, it was not with an envelope of cash, but with an offer of legal counsel, and, more importantly, a voice that tried to reconcile distance with responsibility. "You should not have been put through this," he said. "I can open doors for you, legal teams who move fast." She listened, folding the evidence back into its place with the mechanical care of someone who had memorized the geography of the small things. "We don't want doors opened for show," she said. "We need something that holds." He considered, and in that pause she felt the complex geometry of his world: deep pockets, appointed counsels, reputations that could be soaked in statements and made sober. She had little taste for being rescued by the kind of mercy that was publicity in a suit. Rescue that left you a paper doll in a corporate window did not interest her. They turned to witnesses. The clerk in accounts payable, a junior man named Raphael with an exhausted kindness and the kind of handwriting that curved in the margins, was the sort who kept things like little regrets in a desk drawer. He had stayed late one night, he said, and seen lines in a ledger that did not match the receipts. He had not wanted trouble. The ledger was supposed to be tidy. He spoke haltingly about a file he had not touched but seen altered. His admission was small and shaky, but it became a brick. Another brick was a courier named Deshawn who had the habit of whistling near the docks. He remembered a night when a pallet had been left in the rain and then loaded into a truck with a tarp that had a tear. "If you leave stuff in storms," he said, "someone notices. Rats get in, water swells the boxes, people complain." That night there was no complaint. That's how I knew something was different. His testimony was not dramatic. It was ordinary and therefore credible. They moved slowly and methodically, like a surgeon who prefers small incisions to a reckless plunge.
For every grand moment Sarah had, there were hours of tedium. Requests for archived records, calls to the GPS aggregator in an office in Queens, waiting for responses, like messages in bottles, that may or may not come back. When responses arrived, they were often oblique. Request received. Processing time estimated 2 to 4 weeks. It was civil resistance, bureaucracy rendered as a wall. On a rainy afternoon, a junior accountant, someone whose name, once spoken, became the hinge of the next phase, came to Sarah with a cigarette stubbed in a sleeve and eyes that looked like they had been up for too many nights. He had been the kind of person who noticed the ways numbers curved when you pushed them. He had kept copies of journal entries because he liked to see how the company's books told stories about itself. "I thought I was making a note," he said. "Then I thought I had accidentally covered up something. I'm not a hero." He brought printouts and a confession that read like a small, frightened biography. He said he would stand behind his files, that he would testify to the way entries had been shifted in the name of processes. With every witness, Sarah felt something like the lifting of a tide. The evidence she had hoarded like a nervous habit began to assemble into a narrative that could be told aloud. The receipts were stubborn. Their smudges and stamps were physical, not easily faked. A handwriting expert, brought in quietly by Ethan's legal contact, matched the pressure points on a suspicious transfer to a stylus used by an assistant who reported to Veronica. The tonal match was not incontrovertible. Experts disagree, but it tilted the scale of plausibility. The paper resisted being cleansed. There were moments when the work of collecting evidence hurt in practical ways. Veronica used her influence to freeze Sarah's access to the restaurant payroll, to suggest she was a flight risk to some benefit fund. Marcus tried to recruit co-workers into a narrative that made Sarah's work look like theft by attrition. Sarah's phone filled with messages, some cruel and some trying to be kind. She learned to read the timing of the hits on her social accounts, the slow drip of whispers that can become a flood. She learned what it meant to be very visible in a world that preferred certain people to remain invisible. The critical twist came when they recovered a physical object that Veronica had assumed was immaterial, a carbon copy form lodged in the glove box of a truck Marcus used. JR found it on a late morning when the driver left the box unlocked, and the lock scented of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. The carbon copy bore a faint print of a number that had been altered by hand. It matched the handwriting found in the ledger Raphael had saved.
When Mateo provided the footage from a courier camera, grainy, a silhouette of a man moving crates at 2:10, the timestamp on that footage corresponded to her boat rental slip timestamp indicating a small craft at Pier 59 5 minutes earlier. The chain tightened into a rope. Ethan watched these developments with a kind of private agitation. He had orchestrated certain threads of this work by setting an experiment, more so he had told himself. He had not anticipated the frame. When he finally called Veronica into his office and asked her flatly about the irregularities, she smiled in a way that was almost disarming. "We are stabilizing the system," she said. "Your people are perhaps seeing more than we expected." That language, allowed to be neat and authoritative, masked a moral architecture he could no longer comfortably inhabit. He had, in some measure, been the patron of a process that weighed differently on the powerful and the powerless. When he turned over the documents to the board with Sarah's folder appended, it was because the weight of the paper was undeniable even to people who preferred screens. Physical receipts have the stubbornness of fingerprints. They smear and stay visible. The eventual board meeting that followed was not a single cinematic piece, but a long, awkward sequence of confrontations. Veronica arrived with an entourage and a practiced smile, Marcus with a lawyer whose suit made him look unassailable, and Sarah with a stack of hunched paper and witnesses who smelled of docks and thermos coffee. The room had the same clinical light as the first meeting, but the air was different now. People noticed the coffee stain on Mateo's sleeve, the way Raphael's thumb betrayed his nerves, the way the junior accountant spoke in sentences that were both humble and precise. Sarah placed the receipts on the table as if arranging flowers. She spoke, not because she wanted to perform, but because someone had to describe what the paper was saying. She let each piece be what it was. She let the witness statements live in their small, credible forms. Mateo described the scanner's chirp. JR spoke about the boat rental slip. Raphael told them what he had found in the ledger. The junior accountant explained the mechanics of the edited entries. Veronica's calm began to chip. She had relied on the assumption that procedure would protect her, because procedure was the language she wielded. But paper has weight. When a courier stamp can be matched to a physical smudge that is visible under a certain light, when a carbon copy betrays an altered number, when a little man from accounts looks you in the eye and says he saw machine edits, then the edifice of carefully arranged perception begins to show cracks. There was a moment when the boardroom felt less like a tribunal and more like a series of long, sustained gazes. Some board members shifted, like people whose investments had never been in the business of moral clarity, only in earnings. Others, looking at the paper in front of them, recognized the basic problem, that you could not explain away a series of physical coincidences with a narrative of innocent oversight. Policy had to be accountable. Donors had to know their funds were not silently siphoned into a habit. Marcus's defense faltered when his truck's logbook, kept by a foreman who believed in blunt honesty, returned a clean statement. The police were called in to look at irregularities beyond the board's internal review. Law enforcement moved with the bureaucratic measuredness that the DNA had warned would be present. Not television justice, but the slow mechanics of warrants and interviews and seized devices. Marcus faced the immediate consequences of being an expedient target of legal scrutiny. He was taken into questioning based on the documented chain of physical evidence, and charges would be considered. Veronica, stripped of some of her influence as the board demanded an independent audit, found her circle thinning. Ethan, too, did not walk away with his reputation unscathed. An external review of procurement practices was initiated. Auditors asked questions that suggested reputational risk and potential fines. He accepted that his earlier decision to keep a distance at the meeting had been naive. He offered resources to Sarah. He did not offer to dictate her redemption. The language between them changed. He spoke less in the tones of patronage and more in language that purred around accountability. The story did not end with people being carted away in dramatic scenes. Marcus's arrest was the kind that looks different in real life from a TV depiction. There were forms to fill and a series of held interviews, charges to be contemplated, and no certainty where they would land. Veronica's fate was a professional unraveling. She stepped down from chair committees, and her sphere of influence shrank under the pressure of donors who did not want to be entangled with optics. Even's company faced fines and reputational damage that would take months to sort. An independent oversight committee was proposed. These were consequences, not resolutions. They were the work of institutions that could be slow and awkward and partial. For Sarah, the real measure of success was quieter. It was in the calls that came weeks later, a letter offering a settlement that would cover Leo's surgery costs if she signed a release, an offer to work formally on an integrity team with a modest salary and actual authority to oversee manifest audits, an invitation to participate on an advisory board for a new foundation Ethan proposed that would aid families in crisis. She listened to each offer with the caution of someone who had learned not to trade dignity for expedience. She did not want to be a symbol with no power attached. When she and Ethan finally sat at a small table, private, civil, he pushed a card across with the legal contacts and an outline of the foundation. He did not grandstand.
"I can help make sure this doesn't happen to others," he said. Sarah looked at the list of objectives: emergency medical grants, a hotline for workers with proof of access protocols, funding for paper-based audits and logistic chains. She read the governance terms and then folded the document back. "I don't want you to run my life," she said. "I want a foundation that listens to the people it's supposed to serve. I don't want a plaque with my name on it. I want authority." It was a negotiation that looked small because it was not theater. She insisted on actual oversight powers, on a board that included voices from the docs, from clinics, from people who knew what it meant to be precarious. Ethan balked at first. He had imagined a patronage model, but she pushed until the offer reflected some of her limits. They agreed on a structure: an independent foundation with staff chosen by a committee that included Sarah, a separate audit line that would report to an external firm, and a modest stipend to secure Leo's immediate care, without making them beholden to a gesture of gratitude, could be rewoven into leverage. The settlement did not look like total vindication. There were photos in the local paper that smudged the story into digestible soundbites, some kinder and some crueler. Friends who had been distant called, some apologetic, some briskly practical. Jessica came by one night with 2 slices of takeout pizza and a face that had learned to look ashamed in small ways. "I should have stood up," she said. They reclaimed an ordinary friendship in the chair by the counter that had hosted countless lunch breaks. Legal proceedings continued in the slow, administrative way the DNA had predicted. Investigations into procurement practices were initiated. An independent audit reported irregularities that recommended reforms. Regulators suggested fines and compliance measures. None of it read as immediate justice, but the paper Sarah had kept forced a conversation that would otherwise have been smothered in charm and process. The system, reluctant and cumbersome, had been pushed to reflect on itself. In the months that followed, Sarah learned to move in a set of small routines that knitted together her old world with something new. She met with legal teams, yes, but she also learned to write policy proposals in plain language so the foundation might not be a showpiece. She sat at long tables with auditors and described how a courier stamp could be worn to the point of invisibility, and what that meant in practice. She trained other workers in how to keep paper trails and how to preserve carbon copies, and how to request archived audio without being ignored. The work of reform is 1,000 small rules, a kind of domestic engineering. There were quieter scenes, too. Leo's cough grew less fierce after surgery and months of therapy.
He learned to paint his dinosaurs with bright, unbandaged limbs, and to underline his name in the corner of every page he made with a flourish that became part of his handwriting. Margins of risk. He had underestimated the power of paper and the stubbornness of someone determined to be legible. That misreading, the moment he had chosen distance at the first meeting, would be the thing he told a few confidants he regretted. Veronica, once a permanent presence in fundraising calendars and gala speeches, found herself on the outside of committees she had curated. She retained some professional allies, but lost the inevitability she had counted as decorum. Her resignation from some roles looked clean on paper and messy in practice: donor letters, severance packages, and attempt to preserve a reputation that had been scored with doubt. She fought back in small legal suits and PR statements, but the urge to recast the story as simple misunderstanding grew thinner as audits published their findings and donors asked for accountability. The work of dismantling perception had been harder than she had expected. Paper and witnesses had made the story stubborn. Marcus faced interrogation and an arraignment that was procedural rather than cinematic. The charges he faced, the kinds that hinge on a trail of paperwork and corroborated activity, took time to process. The legal world chewed and considered. He would not vanish into cinematic punishment. He would be processed and perhaps plead, perhaps contest. That messiness was a necessary part of reality. It did not make the outcome neat, but it made it real. The foundation launched with modest fanfare and a governance structure that had Sarah's fingerprints on it. They named a surgical fund in Leo's honor, not as a permanent centering of one story, but as a practical instrument. Grants of modest size, rapid deployment for families with emergent needs, a protocol for preserving paper-based evidence for workers who lacked digital access. The first grants were small, enough for an emergency procedure, a crown for a child's tooth, a rent late fee paid before eviction.
Each application was accompanied by a volunteer who could help preserve documents, a legal line that would consult pro bono, and a promise of privacy that felt like a sanctuary. Sarah insisted on an advisory panel that included people like JR, Mateo, and Raphael, ordinary names who had become necessary to the structure. Their presence ensured the foundation did not become a received narrative, but a working machine. She designed intake forms that were short and human, not bureaucratic walls, and she fought for a budget that would fund field workers who would teach paper preservation techniques in places where a single printer copy could be the difference between a claim and a cold ledger. The structural reforms moved slowly. Procurement processes were reworked, courier audits became routine, and a policy of dual authorization for internal transfers was implemented. It was not enough to make the world perfect, but it made it harder to slip shipments into unmarked trucks. It created friction in the administrative machinery that, ironically, would save a lot of grief for some people down the line. There were smaller reconciliations. Jessica returned a favor by lobbying in small ways for staff to be trained in whistleblower protocols. Henderson offered an awkward, sincere apology in the manager's office, and then brought Sarah a coffee without being asked. Chef LaRosa, who once saw the world only in plates, showed up at a foundation fundraiser and donated a night of cooking for a silent auction that did not feel showy but practical. Years later, they returned to Pier 59 in an afternoon that smelled faintly of lemon rind in the sea. The pier had been refurbished in patches, some boards replaced, some lights replaced with LEDs that hummed differently. The shipping shadows still moved, and the yacht still looked like pale moons on the water. Sarah stood by the rail with Leo's small hand in hers, and the framed receipt on a shelf at her office. The jagged 0 had been laminated and hung not as trophy but as memory. She thought of the night she had found the paper on the restaurant floor, and of how that small circle had rearranged the geometry of her life. Ethan visited the foundation once some months later, not the sort of performance that writes headlines, but a measured presence at a board meeting where he listened more than he spoke. He walked past the framed 0 and paused, reading it not as a dare but as a marker, a small object that had the awkward power to reframe how power moved. He had, in a quiet moment some months earlier, sat alone in his office and traced the outlines of the decision he had made to keep distance at the critical meeting. He told himself it had been prudence. He also had to admit it had been cowardice. That admission was private and in some ways more costly than any fine. On the pier, Leo collected a small shell and tucked it into his pocket.
He had grown. The rattling cough that had once punctured nights was quieter now. He painted dinosaurs with bright wings and left receipts with hearts scribbled on them in the pockets of his mother's coat, as if he understood what had been at stake, even though he could not name it. Sarah watched him and felt the years fold and flatten in a good way, scars that had softened, paper that had been turned into policy. The framed receipt hung in the Foundation's modest conference room, a visible reminder of what had begun with a dropped piece of paper. It was neither monument nor relic. It was a document of attention. Visitors asked about it sometimes, and Sarah told the story simply, how a jagged 0 had been a punctuation that could be read in different keys. She never said that it had been a loophole exploited by villains or a charmed talisman of luck. She said that the receipt had mattered because someone had looked. In private, she kept the original jagged 0 folded in a box with Leo's drawings and a magnifier that had the little crescent chip in its rim, tools of an ordinary kind of labor that had become instruments for accountability. The jagged 0 had started as an insolent punctuation, but it had become a hinge, the fold between someone's neglect and someone's refusal to accept it. On a clear afternoon, years after the first night at Pier 59, Sarah watched a man in a faded jacket walk a route she recognized and catch an old boatman's eye. She saw a courier stamp fade under a lamplight and thought of all the little marks people leave. She placed her hand on the rail where the tide moved in patient cycles, and she felt the small solidness of a life not rescued, but remade. The man who once had been whispered about in corridors, called in rumor a Mafia boss, by voices that liked tidy stories, arrived late at the Foundation's anniversary event. He stood in the back of the room and listened as Sarah spoke plainly about the work the Foundation did, grants, audits, training. He realized then, with a clarity that felt almost like pain, that the jagged 0 had been a warning he had misinterpreted. He had seen a test. He had chosen to place distance in the theater of process. That distance had cost him the clarity of a decisive ally, and given him instead the heavy work of repairing the reputation of a man who had underestimated the power of small evidence and the resolve of those who live by it. His realization came too late in one sense. Some damage had been done. Relationships had changed. Reputations had been bruised. But it was not so late that he could not change his behavior. He moved thereafter with a new carefulness, endorsing reforms and opening funds. He accepted that power measured in policy required a modesty that had not been part of his early instincts. The lesson was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic and prosaic.
He took steps, audits, independent oversight committees, not to absolve himself,
but to prevent the pattern that had cost so many their dignity from repeating. At the end of the event, Leo presented his mother with a small folded note he had made at school. His handwriting was still a child's block script, earnest and large. It read, in heavy marker, "To Mom who sees things." Sarah folded it and pressed it against her chest. The jagged 0 on the countertop had been a beginning, not a verdict. It had been a warning and a promise that attention, even an accidental one, could change the line of a life. She kept working. The foundation granted small suckers and taught paper preservation. It hired former dock workers as auditors and paid for telephones at tiny clinics. It did not pretend that a single nonprofit could remake every skewed system, but it aimed to make the friction of wrongdoing costlier and the act of noticing easier. She taught other workers how to look, when to photograph a stamp, how to preserve a carbon copy, where to store a slip so it did not vanish. Those were technical practices, not heroic ones. They fit her temperament, practical and tenacious.
And you hold on to it long enough for someone to see. He nodded, and they walked back toward the city. The framed receipt remained a starting point for what came after, not a verdict, but a beginning. The man who had been called a boss in whispers had learned too late that small warnings, if noticed, could become the instruments of accountability. The cost was real and slow, but it was real. At home, she pinned the child's note to the inside of the magnifier box and shut the lid. The jagged zero, the lemon rind, the stamps, and the smudges, those small things had become a language she could teach. She had turned humiliation into leverage and leadership, and the ledger that had once been a list of demands had become a list of obligations that other people had to meet. If anyone asked how change happened, she would say, not with a single heroic act, but with 1,000 small holds. She would show them the receipts and teach them to see the zero in the margin, to notice the pressure of a stamp, to recognize when a transfer had been quietly altered. And if someone tried to make the work into a spectacle, she would fold the paper back into her pocket and say simply, "Start with what you can keep." If you found the story worth your time, consider sharing it and subscribing for more long-form narratives that look into the small things that change lives.